Hey, what's up guys? This video is the second part for section 8.8, which is difference of squares. So the first part, I show you guys how to factor when you guys have a difference of squares. Well, today I'm going to show you how to solve when you guys have those difference of squares. So first of all, let's go back and review what is a difference of squares. And I give you guys some examples here. Difference of squares is when you are subtracting two perfect square terms. They actually have a perfect square root in a binomial. Now the key word is you are subtracting and they are perfect square numbers. So the example you guys see here, x squared minus 25, that's a difference of squares, and 25m squared minus 64 is also a difference of squares. Now the way I'm going to show you guys to solve is not actually by factoring. I'm going to show you a property using the square root to solve. So we're going to say the square root property. And something else that you guys also have to understand is when you guys have the difference of squares, notice we have an x squared minus 25. Well, we are looking for the value of x when you solve. We want to get x by itself. So in order to use the square roots, let's review what is a square root, and then I'll show you guys the square root property. So in order to use the square root property, we need to understand how to find the square root of a number. You already know that when you find the square root of a number, you're actually asking what number you multiply by itself that gives you guys the number inside of the square root. So I do have the square root of 16 here, and notice that I have two arrows and I have two different numbers here. Well, the answer of the square root of 16 is actually positive 4 or negative 4. Let me explain why. Remember that the definition of a square root is if you take a number and you multiply by itself, meaning you square it, it has to give you a 16. Well, look over here, guys. If you guys have a 4 squared, that's going to give you 16 because you multiply 4 times 4, 16. But if you also take the negative 4 squared, let me just write it down here, negative 4 times a negative 4. The negative is inside of the parentheses, so you have to multiply that by itself. And the 4, negative 4 times negative 4, that's also going to give you guys a positive 16. So when you ask, what is the square root of 16? Well, now you guys have two different options. You can say the answer is 4 or negative 4. And when you start solving by using the square root property, that's what we have to say. We do have an answer that's negative and an answer that's positive. So if I ask you guys, what is the square root of 25? Well, we're going to say is positive 5 or is negative 5. Because those two numbers, when you square them, is going to give you guys the one inside of the radical. You guys have positive 25. Alright, so now we can start looking at the square root property. Now that you know when you solve or you trying to find the square root of a number, you will get two different answers, one positive and one negative. So this is the property, square root property. If you guys have a number, so let me just zoom in here so you can see the actual property. Any number greater than or equal to 0. So notice we have a number and positive number greater than or equal to 0. And you're trying to solve x squared equals n. X squared, that means you have a quadratic equation. The square means quadratic. You have a degree of 2. Then you can take the x and equal that to a positive or negative the square roots of n, which is the number that you guys have in that equation. Why? Well, here's an example. If you have x squared equals 25, you're trying to solve for x. Remember, solving is to get x by itself. Right now, x is not by itself because it has a square. So you have to get rid of that square. So to get rid of the square, you are going to take the square roots, and that's where the property comes in. You take the square root of x squared, which is the left side of the equation, equals the square root of 25, which is the right side of the equation. Well, guess what, guys? When you guys have the square root of x squared, that squared and the square root will cancel each other because they're opposites from each other. The square root and the squared are opposites, they cancel. So all you have left will be the x, the one inside. So every time you guys have an x squared and you're trying to solve, use the square root to cancel the square. On the other side, remember that we do have a positive and a negative answer. So we must put a plus or a minus, and this is the symbol that we use in math, plus minus, to say we have two different answers, one positive and one negative. and we have the square root of 25. Well, what's the square root of 25? 5 right here, but it is a positive 5 or a negative 5. So my answers, we have 2, 1 negative 5, and 1 positive 5. Now some books, some worksheets, some teachers, they like to separate the two answers. When you get to this step, you have a negative 5 and a positive 5. You guys can do that in my class. You guys can do that on the test. But for me, I'm not too picky. You guys can leave your answer as x equals plus or minus 5. So just make sure to know that you know what your teacher wants. All right, so let's go ahead and start solving for the variable when you guys have to use the square root property. Now here we have different equations. 16x squared minus 9 equals 0. And you guys have the second one and the third one. Well, let me explain how do you know when to use the square root property. Remember that a quadratic equation in standard form, you guys have usually a trinomial. And the trinomial is ax squared plus bx plus c equal to 0. Notice the one we have here, 16x squared minus 9 equal to 0. We are missing the one in the middle, the bx term, the one with the x. We don't have that. When you guys do not have the bx term, usually you guys can use the square root property. And that's what I'm going to use here. I am missing the x term. I do have the x squared. I don't have the x. I do have the constant. C is your constant. We have a minus 9, but we don't have the middle term. The next one, same thing. You have an m squared, but you don't have the regular m in between, so we can use the square root property. How do you use the square root property? We want to solve for x. So I'm going to put a box right now around the x. And the x has a squared. We are going to get rid of that eventually, but first we want to get that by itself. The x with the square by itself. So I'm going to do the opposite for the constant. And that's how you start with the in an equation. You start with the opposite of the constant, the one with no variable. So I'm going to add 9 to both sides. This cancels. So I have the 16x squared equals positive 9. I'm going to divide by 16 because I want the x by itself. This turns into 1. So we have the x squared equals 9 over 16. Now, notice the x doesn't have a number next to it, but it does have a square. So this is where the property comes in. You will take the square root of the two sides. And that's why it's called the square root property. So I take the square root on this side, and whatever you do to one side, you do it to the other side. So the square root and the square cancels. You guys have the x here. X equals, I'm going to put a plus and a minus over here. And I'm going to look at the fraction, 9 over 16. You guys cannot reduce, but they are perfect square numbers, the 9 and the 16. So you're going to take the square root of the top and the square root of the bottom, the numerator and the denominator. So the square root of the numerator, the top, is 3, the square root of 9, and the square root of 16, which is the denominator, is 4. So my answers are positive, negative 3 over 4. Can you guys separate the answers? Yes, you can. You can put a negative 3 over 4, comma, positive 3 over 4. So you guys have two answers, but like I said, guys, you can leave your answer in this format. Just make sure you guys have the plus and the minus. If you don't have the plus and the minus, you are missing one of the answers because you're only going to have the positive number but not the negative. So make sure you guys put the plus and the minus. So let's try another one here. The next one, same idea. We do have the m squared. We don't have the one in the middle, so I'm going to use the square root property. I'm going to subtract 32 from both sides right here. I'm going to cancel this one. Negative 162 m squared equals negative 32. 0 minus 32. One thing that you guys also have to remember, I am not factoring. I am using the square root property. So that's why I'm solving. I'm going to divide by a negative 162 here. Divide by negative 162. So this turns into 1. We have the m squared here. I'm looking at the negatives on this side. They turn to positive. Negative divided by a negative is positive, and I can reduce the fraction. If you guys can reduce, you have to. I can reduce by 2 here, so I divide by 2. So I'm going to get a positive 16 on the top and a positive 81. Remember, it's positive because a negative divided by negative will be positive. So we have positive 16 over 81. Now, you guys cannot reduce this fraction and get rid of the square. So to get rid of the square, we take the square root and the square root. So this cancels, that one cancels. M equals, don't forget the plus and the minus, and the square root of 16 is 4. The square root of 81 is 9. So my two answers, M equals positive 4 over 9 and negative 4 over 9. Now this one is kind of already to solve. You just have to get the 36 on the other side. We have to get the letter, the variable by itself. So we have a b squared here. So let's divide by 36. The 121 is already on the other side. That's why I'm not going to do the opposite of that. We want to get the b by itself. So you divide by 36, divide by 36 here. So this would turn into 1. We have the b squared equals, now I'm looking at the fractions, 121 over 36. You guys cannot reduce. So that says the same. 121 divided by 36. Don't turn that into a decimal because we're going to use the square root, remember. So to get rid of the square, that's when the square root comes in. Square root on the other side. So the square root and the square cancels. V equals, you put a plus and a minus. Don't forget that sign. And the square root of 121 is 11. And on the bottom, square root of 36 is 6. So we got the answer. Now these ones, they have a fraction. So you also have to know how to solve quadratic equations using the square root property when you guys have fractions. So let's look at the first one. Y equals 9 over 16 equals 0. Now guys, remember that we're solving. We want to get y by itself. So that means we have to get rid of this fraction. Very simple. When you guys have a fraction here, you can do the same thing as if you guys have a regular number. Imagine the 16 is not here. So look, I took away the 16. So if you guys have a y squared minus 9 equal to 0, well, to get rid of the 9, you guys add 9 to both sides. That's what we're going to do right now. So I'm going to take away this here. I just cover up the 16 so you imagine that that's not there. But we're going to do the same thing. When you guys have negative 9 over 16, you guys add 9 over 16. And you guys do the same thing on the other side. Add 9 over 16. So the two fractions cancels because they're the same fraction. They have opposite signs. So you guys will have 0 there. I'm going to bring down the y squared here, and on the other side, 0 plus 9 over 16 is just 9 over 16. Now you guys will take the square root. So I'm going to take the square root on the left side, the square root on the right side. The square root cancels right here. So we have a y by itself. Bring the plus and the minus down, and you take the square root of the two numbers. 9 is, the square root of 9 is 3, and the square root of 16 is 4. So we have 3 over 4 for this answer. All right. So that's what you do. You try to get the variable by itself. Now the next one here, you guys have the fraction next to the variable, so it's a little bit different. So 1 over 4 b squared, and we have a constant. This one is not a fraction, equal to 0. So let's get rid of the 16 first. You always start with the constant. I'm going to add 16 to both sides here. So this is going to go away. We have 1 over 4 b squared equals, and this is supposed to be a 16. It looks like a 0, so there's the 16. 0 plus 16 will be 16. To get rid of the fraction, right here, remember that you have a fraction next to the variable. They're multiplying 1 over 4 b squared. Well, one way to get rid of this fraction, you multiply by the denominator. So I'm going to do that right now. I'm going to multiply by the denominator here, and I multiply the denominator 4 over here, and that's the one on the bottom. The one on the bottom of the fraction is 4. So when I multiply 4 times 1, that's going to be 4. Keep the denominator b squared, and 16 divided times 4, not divided, 16 times 4, that's going to be 64. Over here, 4 divided 4 turns into 1. So we have the b squared equals 64. No more fractions. Now you guys can get rid of the square. So I'm going to take the square root. That's how you cancel the square. And you take the square root on this side. Cancels, cancels. B equals, don't forget the plus and the minus. Plus minus 8. The square root of 64 is 8. So we got that answer there. And the last one I'm going to show you guys is here. 16 over 25 minus b squared equals 0. So first I'm checking. This one here is not really next to the b. The b has an invisible 1 here. So this is a constant. So first let's get rid of that number. I'm going to do the opposite. Minus 16 over 25. And I do the same thing over here. Minus 16 over 25. So the two fractions cancels right here. So I'm going to have negative b squared equals, and when you take 0 minus 16 over 25, that's just going to be negative 16 over 25. You're not adding, you're not subtracting anything to the fraction, you have a 0. So it says the same, negative 16 over 25. But this variable has a negative next to it, so we have to get rid of that negative. Every time you guys want to solve, the variable cannot be negative. So I am going to divide by negative 1, and that's going to turn to positive, and you divide the other side by negative 1. So we know this is going to turn to positive, so let me just bring the positive b squared equals, over here guys, a negative divided by negative, that's going to be positive, and 16 over 25 divided by 1, that's just going to be 16 over 25. So now you cancel the square. Take the square root here, over here, cancels the square and the square root. So we have b equals plus minus. Don't forget that, guys. We are taking the square root of a number, so we need a positive and a negative. And the square root of 16 is 4. The square root of 25 is 5. So I want you guys to always check if you can reduce the fractions. If you guys can, you have to. Right now we can't reduce. So my answer is here. B equals plus minus 4 over 5. All right, guys, so this concludes my video, and this video is about solving quadratic equations by using the square root property. I do have a video on solving by factoring, so you guys can check that out. But right now, we're just using the square root property. If you guys like my videos, make sure you guys click on the button, the like button. You can also subscribe to my channel. Make sure you guys practice, and I'll see you guys later.